This is an interview with Mrs. Streeter by Sheila Sweeney on April 8, 1980. The location of the interview is Mrs. Streeter's home, and the topic of the interview is Miss Carolyn Foster. Mrs. Streeter, can you tell me a little bit about when you came to Morristown and how you got to know Miss Foster?
Yes, my friendship with Kara Foster has lasted now for almost 60 years. My husband and I first came to Morristown in 1922. We had been living in New York, and we had 3 small boys, under 6. And we decided that if we were going to have them grow up in the country, as we had grown up, my husband and I, that we better get out of all those city streets and all the nasty cars and the bad air and everything else, have them out somewhere where they could play around and be independent and grow up without having somebody leading them by hand across the street and all that kind of thing, which is what goes on in New York. So we looked all around. We went down to the shore, we went out to Connecticut, we went up the Hudson River, and then we came out to Morristown. And we knew very few people in Morristown, but we liked the general atmosphere right away because it was not a suburb of New York. It was a place which had its own history and its own pride and its the things it had done, and it was also lovely countryside. So we moved out here when the youngest boy was only about 6 months old. So for quite a while I was quite busy bringing up children, especially as then we had a little girl about 5 years after that. And those children, of course, are all in their 50s or 60s now and have their own children and grandchildren. So that is the long and the short of my life in Morristown. When we first came out, of course, new people coming to a new place are very much affected by the neighbors and friends of friends who are nice to them in the beginning. And this section of Morristown, which is the western section, and in those days was known as the German section, I believe, mostly because of the Kissels and the Pinnacles, and of course Mrs. MacDonald lived out here too, and Miss Foster, and a number of others. There weren't so many Germans as you could see, but it had inherited somehow or other that nickname. And we are right out on Sussex Avenue, on the way to Washington Valley and the way to Mendon. And it was in those days almost altogether large estates. There were a few little centers of population in Morris Township, but there was a great deal of vacant land. We got out too late for the coaching. Some of our friends out here had coaches, and all the time when they used to go and meet the trains from New York, which you hear about in the early histories of Morristown, that was all over. You see, we didn't come out till after World War I, and that made quite a change in the living ways of people. So we came out here, and one of my mother's friends was Mrs. Gordon MacDonald, Sr., who lived just across the Whippany River from us. And she sort of adopted us. She was a wonderful old lady. She looked exactly like Queen Mary of England. She's very tall, and she used to wear... One time, our house burned down in the middle of the night, and we didn't know where to put everybody, so we went around and knocked on her door and threw stones on her window until we woke her up. And she came down dressed in a beautiful white velvet dressing gown, a little lace cap, and took the 3 maids in and put them in the guest room. So she was one of our first friends, and of course a great friend of Kara Foster's. And Kara lived about, half a mile from us. And on her farm, a place where she lived all her life. So we began to hear from friends that we met about this old lady. No, she wasn't an old lady, of course, then, but about this unusual lady who, when she came to dinner, wore a nice tuxedo, not with pants, of course, but with a skirt and a nice soft silk shirt, and looked very handsome. Her hair was sort of beginning to get iron gray, I guess, by that time. She must have been in her early 40s, I guess, Tara Foster. And we were informed that she was a character, and we always found that she not only was a character, but I think quite enjoyed being a character, and we all enjoyed having her be a character too. So time went on, and we all got better acquainted and saw each other back and forth, learned more about Tara Foster. Some others may have told you more of her early years, because I wouldn't know firsthand about that. As I say, I think she was probably in her early 40s when Ruth came out. But, of course, she was an only child, and her mother must have died when she was quite young. I don't know just when. But she had been brought up by Pa, and Pa was an old crab, and he was, too. He was disappointed, of course, that Kara wasn't a boy. And so he encouraged her to grow up as a tomboy and play around the farm and know all about the animals and all that kind of thing. But he also kept her on very tight rations. He wouldn't give her any money. So she couldn't do as many things as some of the rest of us could, because she couldn't even get from one place to another except with a horse and carriage. He wouldn't let her have an automobile. He wouldn't hire an automobile. So that led to the famous Christmas present, which I think you've been told about already. And there were a lot of us contributed to that. We did our share, and Mrs. Kissel and her daughter, Mrs. Sunderland, and all the MacDonalds and the Garrisons and the Frelinghuysen's and the Moores, and we all got together, and somebody drove it up and did it up in nice white ribbons and red ribbons, left it on the front drive for Christmas morning. And somehow or other, I'm trying to remember just how, but somebody also contributed 2 white doves. I think that was the Frelinghuysen's. They had white pigeons of some sort or other, so they were in on the party too. And that was the best and greatest surprise, I think, that Kara ever had in her life. First time that anybody had ever really put their minds, I guess, on what she needed, and hadn't been made available to her because Pa was too darn stingy. Also, I guess he didn't believe in girls being independent. And it made all the difference in her life thereafter, because she could just hop in her car and go and see everybody, or go and see the meetings or the activities that she was interested in. So by the time we got out, she was out of hock to that extent, very shortly afterwards. And she certainly was active and interested in everything having to do with the Morristown area and its background all the rest of her life. That was one of the first things I remember about Kara. And one of the next things I remember about Kara was after Pa's death, because Pa eventually died. And in fact, quite soon after we got out. I remember he was a little old withered man and always, a little crabby. Well, anyhow, he died. And at that time, he had been running the place as a farm. But on the whole, not a very good farm. He had a lot of cows, but they weren't purebred cows. They were sort of mixed. And they only gave a reasonable amount of milk. So Kara decided to get rid of most of the cows, have an auction. And she had a big tent up, and everybody went to the auction. And I went with Mrs. MacDonald. my old friend that I told you about that looked like remarried. And we we sat in the tent and watched the cows being auctioned off, and they weren't going very well because I say they weren't purebred. And so we thought, well, something got to be done to steam up the prices a bit. So Mrs. MacDonald turned to me and she said, would you like to share a cow with me? And I said, well, I don't know. I don't know anything about cows. I haven't got any place to keep cows. All I've got's a lot of children that drink milk. What's your idea? Well, she said she had a man on her place and she had a stable and he knew how to take care of cows. And if I would buy the cow, she would take care of the cow and we'd divide the milk 50-50. So we did that for some years. We bid up that cow. So we waited till the farmers that knew something about it had picked a good cow, you see, and then we did that up as far as we could go. And I finally got the cow. Well, Kara said afterwards, Ruth, do you know anything about cows? And I said no, except apparently this is a good one. I'd say she was going to have a calf any minute. And Kara said, yes, she is. Do you know anything about having calves? And I said, less than nothing. So she said, well, I think you better leave the cow over here and I'll take care of her calving. So 4 or 5 days went by and finally Kara called me up to say, yes, the calf had arrived, nice healthy calf. It was a bull calf. Well, nobody, well, maybe you don't know if you're not a farmer, but nobody wants bull calves particularly. They want heifers that will give milk, and we would have liked to have had a heifer. But anyhow, of course, the mother cow gave plenty of milk. But I called up Mrs. MacDonald to break this news to her, and at that time, she had 2 sons. They were about our age, grown up, and we had 3 sons, and neither one of us had any daughters. And so I called up and said, Mrs. MacDonald, I gotta tell you, all we've got is a bull calf, but I don't see how anything that you and I had anything to do with. We couldn't be expected to have anything else. So I don't know, but I think the little bull calf eventually was made into veal or something of that sort. But we did for, I guess, a couple of years, share the milk from the mother, the cow. And I can't remember what happened to the cow after that, but I think it got less trouble to buy the milk than it did to keep a cow. But that was one of the things I remember very clearly about the early days in the foster place. And then I haven't thought especially of particular things that happened after that. These were great events I've been telling you about. But my life was busy and her life was busy, and our paths would cross quite often, but I don't think of anything very especially exciting. Then again, later on, when I got a little freer, we would be working at the same things. Now, of course, she was a very active member of the garden club, and I've been a member of the garden club for years, but I don't have a green thumb, so I'm not nearly as knowledgeable about plants and shrubs and things as Kara was. But she always enjoyed that a great deal, and of course everybody enjoyed having her come, because she had a great sense of humor and a sort of a dry wit. She would tell stories about the old days, and everybody thoroughly enjoyed having her around. And I do know that she was active in politics too. Now, she was a Republican, of course. In those days, Morris County was more Republican than it is now. And I think it was her cousin, possibly her uncle, who was the county clerk and also the real boss of the Republican Party here in the county. And so she was county committee woman, and she always worked hard to get out and vote. and all that. But one of one of Kara's qualities was that she was quite stingy, and we all used to tease her about it. Come on, Kara, now. Why don't you contribute a little money to this or that? And she just hated to part with money very much. So I think in the end she had quite a lot left, but she would contribute in other ways because of her knowledge of the area and her experiences dating back to much earlier days than most of the rest of us. So she was always a great asset at any party. People always enjoyed seeing her and talking with her. Well, that all went along. As I say, we first came out here just after World War One, and then we had a depression, remember? But there was a depression in '29. We may be having another in '80. But that was hard times, and that was hard times for everybody. But most of us survived it, and Kara always lived in that house. She never lived anywhere else. And it's an interesting house, and I'm sure somebody has told you more or less about the house, haven't they?
Yeah.
As time went on, of course, she filled it with these wonderful currier knives, prints, and other things that were appropriate. And you've been in the house, haven't you?
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember all those dead ducks and fish and things in the dining room?
Yes.
Well, General Revere painted those, of course, and they got, in the passage of time, they got dusty and sort of dull. And of course, Kara's eyesight in her later years was not good, so she wasn't particularly conscious of the way the walls were deteriorating. But finally, some of our friends put her up to getting somebody to restore those paintings, and they're really quite interesting now.
Yeah.
If you happen to like still life and dead ducks and fish. But they go with the house and all that carving, from the Black Forest and all.
Yeah.
It's an interesting house, and Kara loved to have people come and see it, and she fitted very well into the house. And another thing that I've always liked about that house, it's on quite a hillside, and you look across at another hill, which was the hill that Mrs. Kissel's house was on, and you have a great space of open sky because there's a field in the foreground, and you should see the moon rise over that. I've seen more beautiful moon rises over there, and because it comes up over these hills and no houses and lights and all in between very much, and she kept that in good order so she could see it. Well, what else did you have in mind to ask me about?
When you said your paths crossed, what interests did you share and did you have in common?
Well, the garden club, and then later on, in the last 15 years, 20 years, we were both very much interested in old houses, historic houses, and restoring those. And she was one of the ones who was always very much interested in Speedwell, which was the home of the Vales, and Alfred Vale was really the junior partner of Samuel F. B. Morse in inventing the telegraph. And the first exhibit of the telegraph was given by Morse at New York University in New York. But he was broke at the time, and he was not really a mechanic. He had the idea, the central idea, but he was not really a mechanic. And young Alfred Vale saw the demonstration, and he realized what it could lead to, and he and his family, he offered his services, and his family put up the money to get the patent, and the machinery for the telegraph was really developed to be practical out here at the old barn at Speedwell. And that's another whole story by itself. But that property descended in the Lidgewood family, who were the descendants of the Vales, until about 20 or odd years ago. And then they all died out, except for some young people who had moved away from Morristown. And the place went to rack and ruin. The people who bought it were only holding it for development, and they let it grow up to a jungle, and they let careless people live in the house. And one of the barns caught fire and burned down, and it was in a dreadful way. And it was then about to be torn down to make room for development. So Kara was always very active in trying to save it, because after all, it was a very important thing, the whole communications, you see. Before the telegraph, all you had was, signal fires, or carrier pigeons, or put a man on a fast horse and send him off with a letter or something like that. And all this business of radio and talk to the men on the planets and things like that, and on the moon, that's all been a development from the scientific experiments that started with the telegraph out here. So Kara was certainly one of the moving spirits on that. And she was eventually, the people who bought the property were public spirited, and they gave to this private organization called the Speedwell Village the corner of the property where the houses and the barn where the telegraph was developed were, so that they could be open to the public, and as they are now. And Kara was one of the first trustees, and always came to the meetings, always had ideas, always voiced them. Usually they were good ideas. And she was a very faithful trustee. She came to all the meetings and enjoyed it all, and we all enjoyed having her come. And I believe, I haven't heard the details yet, but I believe that some of the best trees in the area out there are going to be named after some of the early trustees, and one of them is going to be named after Kara. And they have some beautiful trees, some Norway spruce, some, they have some oaks, and they have some maples, beautiful, great, big trees that must be over 100 years old, I should think. And so it's sort of nice to have them named for individual people. And I'm sure Kara would have approved of that. In fact, she may have known about it because we talked about doing it, but it takes time to get all these things, these thoughts, actually action taken on them. So that she was very much interested in, and you probably know all about her histories of Washington Valley and all. And then another thing she was interested in which I'm interested in too, is McCullough Hall Historical Museum down here in Morristown. And she left some very fine pieces of furniture to us at McCullough Hall. And that is sort of a fun story too, because she was great friends with Mayor W. Parsons Todd of Morristown. I had just reached the point of telling you a little about Mayor W. Parsons Todd of Morristown, who was another wonderful character. And he was about a year and a half younger than Kara Foster. And he was an old bachelor all his life, same as she was an old maid all her life. And I think there was no romance between them, but nevertheless they were good friends and interested in the same sort of thing, because Parsons Todd was a great one on history and on museum houses and restorations too. And so they worked together on that, and I was in on one thing and another in connection with McCaw Hall. McCaw Hall is in Morristown, and it's a very fine old hall, big brick house, and was lived in by a distinguished family for 5 generations. And then it fell upon evil days during the Depression, and was boarded up and really deteriorated very badly. And Parsons bought it for a song, and then had spent a great deal of money to restore it. The floors had fallen through, and it was in very bad condition. But he took great interest in it, restored it at his own expense, and then he set up a board of trustees to manage it, and it's open to the public certain days in the week now. And I'm on that board. Kara, I don't think, she might have been in the very beginning on that board, but she was not too active in that because this came when she was getting old. And as I think I told you, she did leave us some very nice bits of furniture, which at the moment we have left in her own house because we have no immediate place for them, and we thought they seemed sort of at home there, and they, you know, people didn't want to take everything out of the house the minute Kara moved out, and so we have left some of them there. Well, Parsons and Kara were just a well-known couple around Morristown, and they were very fond of each other, and Parsons would come to see her, and he always brought her a birthday cake, and he liked her very much, and she was very fond of him too. And the I think the high point in both their lives probably was a bicentennial parade in Morristown, when they rode in the parade, and really I think were the hit of the parade. And you can see a picture of Kara now down in the post office. Have you seen the pictures in the Morristown post office? Well, Parsons' picture's there, and Kara's is too. And that is our local postmaster, who is a very live wire. What's his name? I looked up the other day. I don't remember the name. She better cut that out. Turn it down. So our postmaster got tired of getting all these posters, you know, of horrible characters wanted for some sort of crime, and the picture of the criminal is supposed to be posted up in the office, you know, so people will recognize him if they see him. I don't know that I would probably wouldn't do anything except run in the opposite direction if I did recognize him, but still, because they were usually terrible looking characters. And the postmaster said he was tired of looking at them, and he thought there were a lot of people in Morristown either still here or who had done interesting and beneficial things for the town. And it'd be much nicer to have some pictures of those people somewhere in the post office than all the criminals. So what's more, he went and did something about it. And if you go in the Morristown post office, not in the sort of front hall where the windows are, but in the L, the corridor off it, you will see all these very handsome photographs. And among them, Kara Foster and Parsons Todd. They were very generally regarded as benefactors of the town. And Parsons was a very generous benefactor of the town. Kara didn't actually, as I said before, contribute much in the way of money, but she contributed a very great deal in the way of local color. And they were good friends, and usually went to each other's parties and wished each other luck. Well, unfortunately, see, Parsons would have been in his 100th year at the time that Kara would have been 101. and she lived to be 102. And Parsons didn't quite get to his 100th birthday. He got within about 6 weeks of it, but then he died. And I'm sure that this was a great disappointment to him because there was great rivalry between them as to who was going to live the longest. And Kara had a wonderful birthday party, which I'm sure they've told you about. Um, Mr. Myers would have done that because that was held at the county headquarters in Miss Matilda Frelinghuysen's house, which is now which she left the county park. And well, everybody in town that could get in got in to wish Kara luck on her 100th birthday. And she was bright as a button too at that time. And she assured us all she was going to live to 104. She'd had some old ancestor that had lived to be 104, and she was going to at least live that long. Well, she didn't quite make it. She only made it to 102. But anyhow, she'd had a very good long life, and she thoroughly enjoyed it. And people were very fond of her, and you know, sort of looked up to her a good deal. And so I think that was really the best time that she had. Was on her 100th birthday.
Okay. Was she